Welcome everybody. Welcome to Engagement Rising, the webinar that we're hosting on the latest report that we just released. I'm Evelyn Waiwaioli, the Director for the Center for Community College Student Engagement, and by the looks of everyone that signed up today, we have a lot of friends that have joined us and then a couple new folks that we don't know so well, but we're real glad that you took the time today to learn a little bit about the report that we released on March 9th. If you don't have the report, I know probably most of you do, but if you don't or you just need a few extra copies, you can always download it on our website, and most of you are obviously, because you registered for the webinar, know how to get there, but just in case, it's just www.cesi.org, and by all means go there and get a few more, and if you want hard copies, you can let us know about that as well, and we'll be happy to get you a few more. So just in case you cannot stay for the entire webinar, we don't anticipate this going over an hour, but just in case you can't, the bottom line is that after looking at data for over a decade, the bottom line is if we look at our benchmark items, that on every item that things increased or that they remained the same. So that is so positive. So if you can't stay for the entire hour, you have it all wrapped up in a nutshell. There you go. That everything went up or it remained the same. And we know that that is not by, because the student population has changed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but we know or we suspect that that's because of the good work that the colleges themselves are doing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well in a second. But before we do that, along the way, if you have questions, by all means, just drop those into the Q&A pod, and if we can, we'll respond to those as we go, and if not, or if it looks like most everybody would like to see those responses to those questions, we'll address them at the end. But hopefully we'll keep this pretty conversational, or as conversational as you can in a webinar. Sometimes that's a little bit challenging, but we really would like to have you type in your questions or even just comments along the way, because hearing just Evelyn talk along the way, that just sounds like a long hour. So by all means, join in the conversation. So the first little bit of our webinar is going to just be a little bit of a walk down memory lane. The first thing is, why do we measure engagement? For many of you, and I could name you by name, you've been with us on this journey for a very long time, so you know why your college is participating in either SESI, or perhaps you actually do CC-FESI, or your college does SENSE, and you know why you're looking at engagement. But perhaps for some of you, participating in one of the center's surveys is new to you. Maybe someone actually said, this is something we've been done for a long time, and you're new in your role, and you're actually wondering, why do we measure engagement? The measure of engagement is really a proxy for student success. I won't read the slides to you, but you can see for yourself there that the more actively engaged students are, and we define that by looking at how involved they are with faculty and staff, and also with each other and the content of the class, the more likely they are to be successful. This isn't something we defined. This isn't something that the Center for Community College Student Engagement actually came up with. Many of you that have been in the work of higher education for some time, you'll know that this definition has been around for quite some time because of the good work of scholars across this country and beyond. And you can name that good work, whether it be the 7 principles for good practices in undergraduate education, or the work of How College Affects Students by Pasquarelli and Terenzini, or the work of Vince Tento. Again, it's not a definition we came up with. We turned to the work of scholars and then took that to create these surveys. But I think it's also important to say right now from the onset that it's important to look back at this past decade and what has been achieved and what's transpired when it comes to engagement, because unlike any other time in history, community colleges really have a spotlight on them right now. If you look back to 2010, it was during that year that President Obama really called community colleges to a new challenge, and he called them to say, I really am turning to you to increase community college graduation rates. And he actually defined that as well, and he said, I'm turning to you to ask you to increase community college graduation rates by 50% by the year 2020. That's not something we can measure here at this center, But if we're using engagement as a proxy for student success, hopefully by the end of our time together in the next 50 minutes or so, you're going to see that we sure are moving in the right direction, and that if we're looking at engagement as what's happening in the class, that what you're going to see is with some lag time, hopefully you're going to see increases in completion rates. So as we move down in our time down memory lane and look at how do we measure engagement, again, most of you have been with us for some time. You know that we do that with our instruments, and we have SESI, and then a companion piece to that is CC-FESI, always administered in the spring. And I know if we asked many of you if we could see it to raise your hands, many of you on the line right now would say that you're already participating in SESI right now. And then we also have SENSE, and many of you are also your colleges participate in SENSE, and that's administered in between the third and the fifth week in the fall semester. And you would also know that we use SESI and SENSE for a lot of different reasons, and all of your colleges may use it for very different and unique reasons. But over there to the right, you can see how different colleges have used or participated in the surveys for different reasons. And here's a few ideas and outlined there of how colleges have used the instruments to be able to, one, assess quality of their work, to assess institutional practices, and really to understand the behaviors and experiences of students along with these other ideas that we've outlined here for you. Again, just to continue on, we'll walk down a little bit more of memory lane. We started in 2001, and 12 colleges participated in our pilot. Since 2004, we have the instrument that we have today. And by 2014, 895 colleges had participated, and we had surveyed or collected data from almost 2 million students. My favorite thing when we go out into the field is people will say, well, you know, those just aren't our students. Well, when you have surveyed almost 2 million students, it's really hard to say those just aren't our students. Yes, you may call it something different at your institution. When we have an item that talks about developmental education, you may call it something different. Or if you're from the state of Florida, you don't call it anything anymore. But at the end of the day, the items are written in such a way that hopefully almost all students are going to understand the language and be reflective of the students across the country. So we feel certain that when we've written the items in such a way that they really will capture the student experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about the changes that are up ahead for the future when we get towards the end of our webinar today. A little bit more about where we've been historically. As you all know, we have the SESI benchmarks, and we'll talk about that in a second as we continue on. In 2006, we created our special focus items. Many of you have participated in those. You'll know that for the last few years we have had a high-impact practice special focus items. And then in 2010, we released our online reporting system, and many of you use that. We really encourage colleges to use the online reporting system so they can create their own custom reports, disaggregating data by part-time, full-time students, and that's exactly what we did in this report, or by developmental, non-developmental status, or by race, ethnicity. However, you need to disaggregate data so that it's important and valuable for you at your own institution. So that's a little bit of a walk down memory lane. Again, the report that we just released is called Engagement Rising. A decade of SESI data shows improvement across the board. And again, if you have to step out a little bit before the webinar is over, you'll see that findings from more than 10 years of SESI survey administration show an unmistakable trend: consistent, continuous improvement and engagement, or at least unchanged. So we're really encouraged by that. And what's really important to know is that some skeptics, when they might read this report, would say, well, perhaps those that are attending community colleges, the students themselves, perhaps they've changed. Well, right here you'll see a side-by-side of IPEDS data, students' data or demographics, and SESI respondents. and you'll really see that the student demographics have not changed. There is one exception to that. We do have more Hispanic or Latino students attending our colleges than before. But other than that, there really hasn't been much change. And I'll just leave this slide up for a second. I guess the question I'd ask to all of you is, when you look at this data, is this what your institution looks like? And go ahead up here in the Q&A and just write yes, no, maybe. And we'll pause here for a second. This is the engagement part of the webinar. We've got a yes. Close enough, okay. Perfect. So what you can see are these changes in engagement over the last decade. It's not about the students who are coming into our front door. It's really about, we would like to propose here at the center that it's about the policies and practices that the leaders, and when we say leaders, we mean administrators, faculty, and staff. It's about the leadership at the institution and what they're putting into place at the colleges that are changing the engagement at the college. So again, this just wraps up what we've just said, that the result is of intentional change in policy and practice. And so a little bit before we begin to look at our slides about the data, a little bit on methodology. So we looked at 10 years of data, and there are very few colleges out there across the country. Really, it would just be those that were part of our pilot that have been with us since 2004. Because one thing we like to encourage colleges to think about is, could you do this yourself? How far back can you track engagement? Maybe for your own self, you can begin to think, well, I can't do 10 years of data, but I can do 6. So that's something to think about. That's why we want to go over this methodology section. The other thing we did when we began this work was we dichotomized our responses. So if we had, excuse me, you can see what we did there, never versus ever, sometimes, often, and very. We began to we paired them up. Very little versus some versus quite a bit and very much. We just said very little and some, those are pretty close together. So let's just put those in one bucket. And quite a bit versus very much, let's put those in another. And then as we began to dig a little deeper into how we would do the methodology, we said we're going to look at percentage point changes in responses over time. So let me just pause there for a second, because what I can see is when I look at the participants who have signed up for this, we have a lot of IR folks on this call or on this webinar. When you look at this methodology, any questions from right here come to mind? I do have Jeff Crumpley, our Associate Director of Operations, in the room with us. And if any questions come to mind, we just want to make sure that if you're thinking about mimicking this research at your own college, that we address those. Okay, surely some of those are going to come. So the other thing when we were doing this research is we said, historically, a lot of times when you're talking to colleges, we'll say, we want to look at your data. We want to look at all of your data. And they'd say, okay, let's do that. And what they would inevitably do a decade ago is we would look at full-time, first time in college. And then we would say, okay, what about your part-time students or your developmental education students? But that's happened over time, that more and more questions would come up about, when we say all students, we would begin to ask, colleges would begin to ask questions about what really, who and what were the categories underneath all. So when we began to think about this report, we began to think about what were the subcategories that we saw most frequently broken out in our work that we did with colleges, and also when people went in to do the custom reports on our online reporting system. And it seemed like most often colleges talked about part-time and full-time, and then of course developmental education status, because we know that oftentimes colleges are doing a lot of their work in that front door early experience where 63% of college students that are coming to our colleges are placing into developmental education. So we saw colleges time and time again wanting to break out their reports by developmental education status. So we knew when we started this report we wanted to break out the analysis by enrollment status and developmental education status. So that's how you're going to see us go through this report. So first, we'll take a look at part-time and full-time students and give you just a really quick overview of a couple of the data points. And of course, you can see more in the overall report. And then we also have a lot more on our website in case this isn't enough for you, even just in the report. So what's the typical engagement pattern when we're looking at our part-time students versus our full-time students? Anyone at the college, I'm sure you're thinking, you know, of course, full-time students are more engaged, and that's what we've known for a long time as well. But things have begun to change because we know a lot of our part-timers are going in the evening, and you'll see a lot more colleges doing support services in the evening. And again, that goes back to policies and practices are changing to help our part-time students. There might be a nighttime advisor or a nighttime coordinator on a college campus. So you're seeing things change to help part-time students. So let's look at a few data points of what we've seen change over the last decade. Here's our first one. And you can see that the darker, well, first of all, this is under the benchmark Active and Collaborative Learning. In your experience at this college during the current school year, about how often have you done the following? Made a class presentation. If we look at this, the darker blue line, and I hope you can see the different shades of blue, I can at least on my screen, the darker shade of blue are our full-time students. And as you expect, they made a larger amount of class presentations than our part-time students. But what you see is that the gap is closing. Originally, from 79% to 60%, we had a gap of 19 percentage points. But then it begins to close to 16 percentage points. So something's changing. Something's changing. And that change is happening with faculty's expectations, perhaps their policies. Maybe something's happening with the culture at the college. Not sure, but something's changing. Let's look at the next one. Excuse me. This one is under the benchmark of student effort. In your experience at this college during the current school year, about how often have you done the following? Come to class without completing readings or assignments. Now take a look there. Our part-time students line, the lighter blue line, is now above the full-time students. I'm going to pause there for a second. And over there in the Q&A, let's just take a minute and jot down some of what you're thinking. Why is that happening? Again, this is our engagement part, so it's not just Evelyn talking. I want to hear from all of you. What do you think is happening there? Other commitments besides school, right? College life. Students have to work to pay for school. Anybody else? Well, the part-time student, I think there's a lot of what you've said is exactly what we thought, and all we have is the data itself. We haven't done a focus group on this, so it's hard to know the backstory on some of this. But a lot of what you said is exactly what we suspected, is that the part-time students really had fewer classes to prepare for, where the full-time students, they have many more classes to prepare for. So some of what you already said in your comments. Yep. Somebody there said full-time students have more on their plates, But what we also saw is that the, the full-time students, they reported coming to class. The percentage points there dropped by 10%, or 10 percentage points. So we saw a lot of change happening there for our full-time students. But a lot of the reason why we saw this is exactly what you're outlining up above. So I think it's important to really look at the graphs and look at the data, because what you might expect is not always what shows up. One more graph we can look at, and this one's under the benchmark of academic challenge. And this one is, have you used information? I'm sorry, let me back up a second. During the current school year, how much has your coursework at this college emphasized the following mental activities? And this one's about using information you have read or heard to perform a new skill. And if you look here again, our full-time students are above our part-time students. And the gap isn't changing. I mean, we have a 6% percentage point change in the very beginning to a 7% percentage point change at the end over the decade. So it's still moving in the right direction, not closing as tightly as we would like it to. But again, these are things that we can begin to change the more and more we work with faculty. And I'm always reminded of this one time when I went to work with faculty a long time ago, and a faculty member stood up and said, "Please don't assume I know how to engage faculty." So engage students. So I think some of this is, just beginning to really value and work with faculty on professional development and helping them think about how do we do things in a new and innovative and creative ways. We see change happening here. It's not happening at the rate that we would like it to happen, but it definitely is happening and occurring. Any questions when we look at enrollment breakouts? And we've given you 3 examples. There's quite a few more in our report, but we're going to move on to looking at developmental education here in a second. Okay. So in the next section of the report, we looked at developmental and non-developmental education students. And for those of you that have been working with us for some time, this won't be a surprise to you. And for some of you, it may just be counterintuitive. I know for me, it has been for a long time. And I always have to be kind of, I have to go to folks here at the center and say, can you say that to me one more time? Because it doesn't always line up for me. So when you ask yourself, what's the typical engagement pattern when we're looking at developmental versus non-developmental education students, just think about that for a second. Any thoughts there? And maybe go ahead and just type them in. What do you think is our pattern here at the center? Yep, Dev Ed students are more engaged than non-Dev Ed students. Thanks, Victoria. And I think for me that's a little counterintuitive, because typically we say the more engaged, the more likely you are to be successful. But we know that's not the case when it comes to developmental education students. But what we do know is that developmental education students have a tremendous amount of more supports. Typically, they're going to have more supplemental instruction or tutoring, or a lot of times when it comes to policies and practices, that might be the place where colleges begin with learning communities. So we know that that's where they're going to have typically more engagement with developmental education students. So what we wanted to see is, well, what's been happening in the last decade when it comes to developmental education students versus non-developmental education students when it comes to engagement? Is this still the trend that they're more engaged? Are things changing when it comes to non-developmental education students? and we'll give you a snapshot of what we saw. So let's look at active and collaborative learning, again, one of our benchmarks. And you can see that with this particular item, here it is, in your experience at this college during the current school year, about how often have you done the following? And we're looking at developmental education students versus non-dev. How often have you worked with classmates outside of class to prepare class assignments? Now, right off the bat, you can see that developmental education students are more engaged. The darker blue line is above the lighter blue line. But if you look at the percentage point change, you can see that the gap is closing. We moved from 55, a change from 60 percentage point, or 60% over 55 to 65 over 62, and we see that the gap is getting smaller. So we see our non-developmental education students becoming more engaged. So something's happening. We must, we suspect here at the center that we're taking what we're learning and also what we're doing with our Dev Ed students and transferring that to our non-Dev Ed students. So let's look at another example. Here we are with our academic challenge benchmark, and the item is, how much does this college emphasize encouraging you to spend significant amount of time studying? So we're looking at time on task. And again, like we've always known, developmental education students, they're more engaged than our non-Dev Ed students. But once again, the gap is getting smaller. We go from 75% to 80%, over 64% to 72. And when you look at 80% over 72, we're now at an 8% percentage point change. So again, we continued, as we wrote this report, we began to think, what's happening here? What's happening at colleges? What's going on? And again, we haven't conducted focus groups on this work yet, but what we're suspecting is that we've taken what we've been learning with our developmental education students and we're transferring it to our non-dev students. And also, students are talking and sharing, and there's, when you have over 60% of your students are Dev Ed, they're not a small population. So they're also talking with non-dev students, and our non-dev students are also learning from dev students about what's working for them, and they're finding out that, okay, you were in a learning community, or you went to tutoring, or you went to supplemental instruction, or you did, they're finding out what's working. So the college is learning about what's working, but students are also learning about what's working. So let's look at one more example. Now this one is in here about developmental students, and it's about student and faculty interaction. But I also just think it's what I call the myth buster. I just found it extremely intriguing, and I think we all still chuckle about this one here at the center. And it's, again, under the benchmark of student and faculty interaction, and I'm hoping some of you are going to have some responses about this because we really want to have a better understanding of what's going on here. And I know all of you are on the ground level back at the college. And the item is, in your experience at this college during the current school year, about how often have you done the following? And it's used email to communicate with an instructor. And look at that change in the last decade. I'm not going to even get into changes and percentage changes over a decade. There's no need to get into that. I think everyone on this webinar can tell what's going on here. All we can conjure up here at the center is that back in 2004, colleges were not distributing emails as widely as they are now, and now they're distributing them widely, and at times making it mandatory for them to be used. But if you wouldn't mind, would y'all just, we have 39 participants on the webinar right now, would y'all just type in a little bit about what do you think is driving this dramatic change? Because the conversation in the field is that, oh, students don't do email anymore. They do Facebook, they do Twitter, they want you to text them. The conversation is you're not going to be able to communicate with the students via email. So what's going on here? Help us understand a little bit. And I'll just pause and give you guys some opportunity to do that. So quite a few of you responding. Students have access to the email all the time. Students know that faculty use this technology, so they know they need to use it. Many students have email opportunities to email from LMS. Perfect. That's when we saw this, again, the conversation that we hear all the time in the field is that email's dead. Students don't do email anymore. So we were just really curious about what's driving this dramatic change. So thanks for your feedback on this. We really wanted to hear from people in the field about what was happening at the colleges. So just a few more bits of data that we found interesting as we did this report. From the findings, we also saw that 76% of students report that all their instructors clearly explained a class attendance policy. I don't know if we could have said that a decade ago. The founder and the previous director of the center often said students don't do optional, which led to a lot of things like this, a class attendance policy being put into place, and also things like the word mandatory being put into place. So I think we've come a long way, and that's why we often say when we release this report, this wasn't about the students changing. This was about policies and practices and the importance of intentionality, changing the culture at a college, changing this trend in engagement. Another data point that we found intriguing is that the percentage of full-time students who never skipped class rose 12 percentage points. Again, going back to the importance of intentionality. You don't have to answer this one in our Q&A, but I guess I would ask you, as you're sitting here on our webinar today, what would these data points look like at your college? Is this something you would create a bumper sticker for or put up a sign or a banner at your college? Because these are really impressive. And would you be able to say this at your own college? And that's the work that SESI is really about. A lot of times colleges say, oh, we do, and we laugh around here at the center, but we'll say, we do the SESI. Well, we're not just the SESI. We really want colleges to think about what do you do with the data. We really want you to have an understanding of, okay, now I have this data point. Now what do I do with it? How do I improve it? How do I make things better? And that's why, as we talked about early on in this webinar, having an understanding of how we did this methodology so that perhaps you could do that at your own institution. Perhaps you've done this. Perhaps you've done SESI 3 times over a period of 6 years. Are you able to track how things have changed over time at your own institution so that you can be able to say, things have risen for us 12 percentage points, whatever that particular item is, so that you can tell your story to the public, to your board, to your faculty, to your students. A little bit of other information that we're able to tell on our survey is about the economy and its impact. Some of you, this won't surprise you at all, especially if you come from a state that was hit very hard by the economy, or perhaps maybe you're in a state that wasn't hit very hard at all. But this was interesting over the last decade. The percentage of part-time students reporting that they worked more than 30 hours per week dropped 15 percentage points. And then the percentage of students saying that they most frequently took day classes increased 13 percentage points. You can see where those two went hand in hand. And a lot of this comes off of the part of our survey where we ask about financial aid or some of our demographics questions. But again, this would also, if you had this information in a timely fashion, you may begin to think about what are some policies and practices we would put into place to respond to what's happening with our students and when they're taking classes and how their work patterns have changed. Just some things to think about. Again, the economy's impact, we also found this over the last decade. The percentage of full-time students saying that they had a goal of obtaining or updating job-related skills rose 9 percentage points. Again, for some of you across the country, this wouldn't surprise you at all, especially where many people were losing jobs. And then the percentage of all students citing loans as a source for paying for tuition rose 12 percentage points. Again, not a surprise for many of you. I guess, again, I would just ask you, what would this look like at your college? And so kind of back to where we started all of this, 35 minutes ago, the overall levels of engagement are holding steady or they're moving in a very positive direction. And we're very excited about that, mostly excited for all of the good work that you're doing. But there is still room for improvement. For the last 3 years, we've done a significant amount of work here at the center in high-impact practices, and many of you participated in those special focus items. And what we see is that participation in those high-impact practices is oftentimes quite low. Many colleges across the country have these practices in place, and you could name those practices: learning communities, student success courses, orientation, supplemental instruction, tutoring, you could name them. But when you look at the number of students that are actually participating in these practices, the percentage is very, very small. So we have a lot of room for growth there. And then there's still quite a bit of room to be done when it comes to closing gaps between subgroups. And I'm sure you know that by your own work at your own institution. I'll pause there for a second just to see if any of you have questions about the data that we reported over the last decade. Okay. It looks like we have a question that came in, and Jeff, our Associate Director of Operations, who's been here since 2004 or before, when all of this good work started. He's going to respond to it.
So one of the questions that was asked early on is whether the differences we're showing on these slides were tested for statistical significance. So first of all, what I'll say is if you go to our website where the national report is published, there's a link that will take you to the full methodology and the full results for everything we did during this study. So you can find the detailed information there. But what I'll tell you is that we approached this in a little different way because we were looking at data over time. So what we did was we looked at the percentage point change over time, and we set a criteria here at the center to say we're just going to display in our report where responses to an item have changed 7% or more. And we chose that 7% number because we knew that typically when we do statistical significant testing in our data, that 7% or more will always generate a significant difference. So the answer to the question is, do all of these charts show significant differences? Both yes and no, because in some cases one subgroup on the chart has a 7-point difference, but we wanted to always show you the comparative group. So sometimes we'd show items where there weren't quite the 7-point difference. So we really wanted to show you two things in these charts. First, we wanted to show you is that trend line over time, which, as you all know, things often change pretty slowly in colleges. And for years, when I was looking at national data, I would say, gosh, these numbers look very much like they did the year before and the year before. But when you start looking at it over a 10-year period of time, you see how those things add up over time. So again, if you want to know any details of the analysis, you can see it on our website. And of course, you can always pick up the phone and give me a call, and I'll walk you through any detail you want to know as well.
Any other questions about the research itself? Or any other questions about the methodology or? Okay, well, at the back of our reports, you may, pardon me, you may have noticed that we talked a little bit about where we're going in the future. In 2017, we will be releasing a new version of SESI Refresh. And I know for some of you, you may be thinking, well, what does that have to do with then us tracking our data over time? Well, the good news is that the benchmarks themselves, there will not be changes with those benchmark items. But what I can tell you is that it's time for the survey to have an update. And it's not an overhaul by any means. It truly is just a refresh. And we've given you an outline of kind of where we're going to be going with this. So the high impact practice items, all of those things that I just talked about a little bit when it comes to orientation or supplemental instruction, student success courses, all of those items that we've been looking at for the past 3 years and that the field has been looking at to see their impact on student success, all of those will be incorporated into this survey. But there are some items that needed to really come off. For example, many of them are technology related. There's a couple items that talk about like a chat room or things of that nature, and those really needed to come off because they're no longer appropriate. There's also some things that, there's some response options that really needed to just be tightened up, and so we're going to be doing that. CC-FESI will also be updated to match, but the overall look, feel, and use will remain the same. If you have any questions about SESI Refresh, you can go to our website. We have a top 10 questions about it that will outline everything. It's still going to be paper and pencil, still going to be administered in the same way. If you have any questions right now, you can type those in. We'll be happy to answer those for you right now. You know, we just want to make sure we give people plenty of time to plan and just be aware that it is coming. You know, one of the things that we did not ask 10 years ago when we started all of this is anything about veterans. So there'll be a new item on there about, you know, are you a veteran? So you can just tell it's time for just a refresh. And that's really what it is. It is not an overhaul in any way. So if you have any questions, by all means just type it in, or you can visit our website and see the questions that we've put together to help respond to folks that may be interested. And I'm just looking over to the side to see if any of you do have any. This is a great question that just came in. How can you recommend to best use this report in our colleges? You know, I think the best way to use this report in colleges is a couple ways. One is just to sometimes just give people a pat on the back, because colleges are doing a lot of great work, and this is a way to show the movement of the needle over time. You know, we all know that changing cultures and putting practices and policies into place to see the effectiveness of those practices and policies in place takes time. And that's what this does. This shows the effectiveness of the work that colleges have done. Now, on a very, very macro scale, but it shows the effectiveness of those practices and policies in place, put into place over time. But then I think the things, if I was going to show this at an institution, as somebody in the audience, then I would want to say, well, what does it look like at our institution? So then as an institutional researcher, I would need to be prepared to be able to do that. So, you know, that's why I said when we were going over the methodology section, you may want to be able to, you know, call into Jeff or Mike Bolig, our senior researcher, and we'd be happy to help you do that. But to be able to show your colleagues, you know, here's where we've really made some strides. Because I'm sure if you're joining us in on this call or this webinar, there's no doubt in my mind you're engaged, you're invested, you're part of this work. So there's going to be some places where you've really made some progress. But then there's going to probably be a few places where you need to dive a little deeper. And so then you just focus on those areas. But you really, I would use this as, you know, as a sector, as a field. We're moving the needle, and here's how. And then show what you can do at your own institutional level. That's a great question. Anybody else? Questions? Well, so there's a few more minutes, and we'll just leave it open for questions if you have any along the way. But when I started this, I talked a little bit about when President Obama put the challenge out to community colleges about increasing the completion rate. One of the pieces of data that we did not report in this report was about, excuse me, students' goals when they come to community colleges. And we have an item on our survey that talks about, what are your goals for attending this college? And that has definitely changed over time, and I think that's encouraging. So back in 2004, for certificate programs, we had, well, let me just say this. For certificate programs, we have seen an 8 percentage point change, and for our associate degree programs, we have seen students that the line chart has changed 5 percentage points. So what we're seeing is more and more students are coming with the goal of obtaining a certificate program, obtaining a certificate degree or an associate degree. So just back to that comment I made early on about President Obama and this challenge before community colleges, and seeing that engagement is increasing across all benchmarks or remaining the same, and that our students are coming with higher aspirations. There is going to be a lag time because this is what's happening in the class, and we need to see how it's going to play out with completion, but we're definitely moving in the direction that we had all hoped for. So to all of you that are joining us on this webinar, we just congratulate all of you. You're on the front lines, and we just want to say thanks for allowing us the opportunity to walk alongside you and really just measure and help support the good work that you're doing. If any of you have questions, we'll keep this open for another 5 minutes or so, or you can always just call us, and we'd be happy to walk through how you can measure your data over time on the phone, or set up a conference call to be able to work with you and a team of folks at your college. But again, thanks for letting us walk alongside you and for being a part of your team. Thanks for joining us, everybody.